part of this event and to start the proceedings, which of course begin at the end, the unfinished end. So that means politics and a lot of it. But I'm not going to unpick Cornelius's philosophy or motivation. I simply want in the next hour or so to try and represent and encapsulate what he was actually doing at the time. Those of you who have waded through my book may well get a distinct impression of déjà vu, but I hope you'll agree that some things do bear repeating. I'd like to begin with a thesis which I still hold, despite reservations from some quarters, that there is an ethical, humanist thread which runs through Cardew's life's work, which can be demonstrated, beginning with a flight to Cologne, away from the stifling conservatives of the Royal Academy, the subsequent jettisoning of total serialism, freeing the performer through indeterminacy from the straitjacket of that system, freeing the performer with the scratch orchestra, or rather followed by the abandonment, I've overtaken myself, followed by the abandonment of notation, and freeing the performer from the constraints of symbols on manuscript paper, and to the scratch orchestra, where people deemed unmusical by the educational system found themselves permitted, encouraged, indeed freed to make it their own music. So what is left? Well, what is left is that people grasp their destiny, not just their musical destiny, with their own hands to determine and manage their own lives. So what we see is a constant, with Cardew, a constant imaginative extension over the boundaries of human freedom. Free, in the words of the diggers, to turn the world upside down. A quest which Cardew quickly learned required an indomitability, the willingness to make supreme sacrifice, and which was fraught with a danger, just as the diggers some 300 plus years ago had felt. The consequences of this stand by Cardew were for many people, including close friends and family, highly problematic, to say the least. What people failed to recognize or simply could not accept was that for Cardew, it really was a matter of life and death. That he put his life on the line, that he was fighting a war against a ruthless enemy, the rich and the powerful, who would stop at nothing. And to do this, a quasi-military discipline was necessary, which meant in turn a culture of secrecy, and which certainly involved danger. His open support for Irish republicanism, his willingness to go to the Republican clubs and fraternize with people whose lives were threatened on a daily basis, meant that he too would have been regarded as an enemy of the state. Similarly, his open support for Bangladeshis and other Asian groups, especially when he was living in Laken with Sheila, meant that he was on a national front hit list. Cardew was always in the forefront when it came to upholding the party line of fascists have no right to speak. He led demonstrations in defiance of the police and their protection of the fascists. It is true that we have no concrete evidence with regard to his death, but the circumstances surrounding it were mighty suspicious. We know the state acts preemptively. The fact that the organizing committee for the People's Democratic Front, of which Cardew was a key member, organized an event, a conference against racism and fascism, in the year of his death, 1981, which drew a packed audience of around 500 people and was sponsored by over 100 organizations and individuals, which included many militant Asian, African, Afro-Caribbean groups, trade unionists, teachers, academics and students, women's groups, political groups, church groups, residence committees, including a Jewish group, youth clubs, arts organizations, and immigrant organizations. An impressive cross-section of the populace, or rather that considerable part of it that identified the rising tide of racism and fascism as a real threat to the lives of many people across the country. This event in itself, and Cardew's role in it, would not have gone unnoticed by state agencies and various other shadowy organizations. This is the context in which we must take stock of Cardew's music during most of the last decade. And let us not underestimate the artistic quest he undertook during the last decade, a quest for a new music which would serve the revolutionary aims of the party, of the ideology he had espoused. So let us now retrace our steps and go back to 1973-74, by which time Cardew had produced the two piano albums and the large-scale Thälmann Variations. Having adopted the bracing certainties of Maoism, Cardew existed on the horns of a dilemma. He had repudiated his previous music and wanted to recover an expressive language with which people were more familiar. The problem, of which he was well aware, was that he was ill-equipped to provide the kind of populist music the party demanded. This is what he wrote, I quote, "In taking this course, a number of questions arise. What material is available? On what musical sources and traditions should we base our work? And in what style should that material be presented? Bearing in mind that it must be accessible to the broad masses of so-called uncultured people. The pieces that I am presenting here are tentative experiments in a number of different directions seeking provisional answers to these questions. Quote, and notice that somewhat diffident tone here. Piano album in 74 comprises just 4 pieces, 3 of which, possibly all 4, were composed while Cardew was in Berlin and are related specifically to political campaigns in the city. The Battalion song from 1973 is a piano transcription consisting of a verse and chorus played 4 times. The music is steadfastly diatonic, as befits a song written to be sung on demonstrations. In an introduction to a concert in Berlin, Cardew writes, and I quote, I was asked to write a song for the campaign. In a few sessions of collective work, we produced the song that I'm about to play. It has 4 verses. It embodies our demand for a children's polyclinic in Battalion, not an artist centre. It sings of our children's future, threatened by the myriad abuses of capitalist society. It derides bourgeois art, exposes the politics of the social democrat urban planners, and indicates the perspectives of revolutionary change with the working people of all nationalities uniting to take their destiny in their own hands. Unquote. Well, in fact, the song did become part of the local folklore, and to this day, people in Kreuzberg still remember it. In a recording of a piano recital from the 70s, mislaid unfortunately, Cardew embarks on the Battalion song, and before long, one by one, the audience joins in, singing along. He certainly would have enjoyed that. It is also proof of the fact, if proof he needed, that he was quite capable of producing a campaign song at short notice, which people would enjoy singing. Let's listen to the Battalion Variation played by a young British pianist, the piano piece, and the song, which was based on the song. in the journals at that time, we read, and I quote, I'm quoting here, I'm convinced, he writes, that when a group of people get together and sing the Internationale, this is a more complex, more subtle, a stronger and more musical experience than the whole of the avant-garde put together. This is not pseudo-scientific fantasy, but represents real people in the real world engaged in the most important struggle of all, the class struggle. And that was by now, in 1973, Cardew's position, clearly stated, and there would be no turning back. In relation to Cardew's later music, the Uruguayan composer musicologist Cornelius Cardew makes some very interesting and insightful references, particularly in relation to England's, quote, imperial culture, unquote, and, quote, imperial scholar training. This is what he writes from Uruguay. What becomes evident is that imperial England is, during the 70s, as provincial as Nicaragua and Albania. Only this fact can explain Cardew's lack of a stronger discussion on what he is doing. The difference is that the imperial culture acquired through the scholar training allows him to really believe he's doing something important for his historical moment. Of course, there is a lack of political background, and this can be understood if we observe, for instance, that going to study in Italy in 1964, he chooses Petrassi instead of Nono as his teacher. I want to say something about that. The reference to a lack of a political background is contentious. For although Cardew was for a long time resistant and hostile to politics and politicizing, his lack of enthusiasm for Adorno and the Frankfurt School, for example, was not necessarily due to Anglo-Saxon parochialism and ignorance. We need only remind ourselves of the long sessions that Cardew spent in the studio in Cologne and of the company he kept there to conclude that an encounter with Adorno's ideas, to which there would have been ongoing reference amongst the studio's inmates, Stockholm, König, Ligeti, Calvis, and many others who passed through, would have been inescapable. And even at that time, in the early 60s, and before Cardew's politicization, Adorno's thesis of the autonomy of art, that the very existence of art is itself a form of resistance to ideological repression, would have met with a measure of skepticism by Cardew. Moreover, it was not only Anglo-Saxons, whether through benightedness or temperament, who balked at some of Adorno's more speculative theories. Hans Eisler, and from a different perspective, Samuel Beckett, both took issue with Adorno on matters in which there seems to have been little willingness to compromise. As for Nono, Cardew was as familiar with the Italian music as most. He knew Nono well in the 60s and he knew the arguments, and in particular, Nono's arguments for political music. Perhaps it is not without significance that it was works by Isler, not Nono, that in 1964, Cardew took to the Petrasic class for analysis and discussion. On his own admission, if we are to take it at face value, Cardew went to Petrasic, quote, to develop a feeling for the orchestra, unquote. It is doubtful whether he had any particular interest either in Petrasic's music or in his politics. Unlike most contemporary leftist political concert music, Nono, Henze, Lachermann et al., comfortably subsumed within the contemporary music canon of Western society, no niche could be carved out for Cardew's compositional experiments. Like Picasso, Cardew's eclecticism signified the deliberate destruction of the unity of the personality. The piano albums are protests against the cult of originality. The fact that these pieces may or may not bear personality traits, that they represent a complete break with individualism and subjectivism, is neither here nor there. They are a political expression, comments, notes on reality from a political perspective. It is this, whatever their shortcomings, which determine the style or styles in which his music was cast. Some of it, in particular from the song collection, was dispensable. Its fate of no consequence. But, we can't leave it at that. Tout court, there is no excuse for writing bad music, and some of it was. By becoming utilitarian, art loses its autonomy, its multiplicity of meanings. For Cardew, it meant that art was to be stripped of its status to become a branch of politics, and the consequences in relation to its own music affected him profoundly. For the Maoists, that is, for Chairman Mao, art was a handmaiden of revolution, albeit with an essential role to play. In the talks at the Yan'an Forum, Mao writes, I quote, although man's social life is the only source of literature and art and is incomparably livelier and richer in content, the people are not satisfied with life alone and demand literature and art as well. Why? Because while both are beautiful, life as reflected in works of literature and art can and ought to be on a higher plane, more intense, more concentrated, more typical, nearer the ideal, and therefore more universal than actual everyday life. Unquote. Well, I think such a text would have resonated profoundly in Cardew, even if he were later to criticize and refute much of what Mao wrote about art. His own life, Cardew's own life, the way he approached being, was indeed livelier and richer in content than countless works of art. Even his espousal of politics arrived by a totally unconventional route. This is the crux, for it was a decision made in the light of his experience as an artist and in relation to how he perceived music as human activity. In an interview in 1996, Cy Ellison, a scratch orchestra stalwart, encapsulated this aspect of Cardew's personality. I quote, "It felt to me that Cardew was into life before he was into music or art. So many people are into music, into theatre, into dance, into this, into that. You talk to them about life, they have nothing to say." But it was very different with Cardew. He made music from life, whereas I think there are a lot of artists around who have lost that connection. They keep regenerating from a musical place, a theatre place, a painting place. Cardew is also with life. I think that's a very good, insightful observation. Cardew was overwhelmed, intoxicated by the Hegelian prospect of life beyond art. Life without need of the semblance of beauty, by the idea of a new human consciousness as yet undreamed of. He could speculate with Hegel that the role of art would not only be transformed by revolution, but it might even render superfluous, superseded by, quote, philosophy. Cardew's Thälmann Variations for solo piano is one of several compositions which he wrote during the last decade. The variation dedicated to the memory of the German communist leader who was murdered in a Nazi concentration camp are divided into three movements or sections, as Cardew calls them, and his introductory text, which is printed in the published score, emphasizes the work's programmatic character, and I quote, "These variations celebrate the proletarian hero Ernst Thälmann. The theme of the variations is the Thälmann song, written in 1934. But I think the tune is an old one, hence the pastoral opening. The whole first section is loosely historical. The pastoral passages at the beginning are interrupted by a militant works' march, which leads to Hans Eidel's tune, Rumours of War, symbolizing the vitality that Thälmann infused into the German workers' movement. Then Charles Koechlin's Libérons Thälmann is used to describe the cataclysm that overtook the German workers in 1933. The middle section comprises three slow variations, songs of sadness, warmth and dignity, commemorating the countless men and women who have given their lives in the fight against fascism. And finally, a complex march of events is dedicated to the present struggle of the German communists against the re-emergence of fascism. Now, this is the good part of the show, because I'm delighted to invite here to the platform Frederic Rzewski, who was a close comrade in arms with Cornelius, a close friend, and a great, if not the greatest exponent of Cornelius's later music. So Frederic, we welcome you, and before Frederic starts,